Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the strategies, stories, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Today, we have a truly exceptional guest joining us, Rich Horwath. Rich is the founder and CEO of the Strategic Thinking Institute, a New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA bestselling author. In this episode, we start things off with a powerful metaphor that underscores the importance of navigation in leadership, inspired by the story of Amelia Earhart. We'll then dive into Rich's definition of what it truly means to be strategic, explore the pitfalls of unstrategic behavior, and uncover the 4 areas of strategic fitness that drive organizational success. Plus, we'll discuss the GOST framework, a game-changing tool for aligning goals, strategies, and tactics. So if you're ready to sharpen your strategic thinking and lead with greater purpose and precision, stay tuned. You won't want to miss a moment of this conversation with Rich Horwath. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Well, let's jump right in. And I love the story that you start the book with, and that's the Amelia Earhart story. Can you share how her story really demonstrates why the ability to navigate is critical to a leader's success?
I think most people are familiar with the Amelia Earhart story. It's one of the great mysteries in history, really, as far as what happened to her. She was one of the greatest navigators, pilots of her time, pioneering, really a great story of courage, of the ability to innovate, to do things differently, to persevere in the face of obstacles. What's interesting, though, is many people don't know on May 14th, 1937, so this is about 6 days before she set off on that historic flight and wound up being her last flight, she received a letter from a gentleman by the name of PVH Weems. And for those who don't know PVH Weems, he was one of the world's foremost experts on navigation. And in the letter, and I share it in the book, he mentions to her that he thinks there would be benefit for her to increase her navigational skills, celestial navigation and other types of navigation, especially when she's undertaking a journey around the world. And so she didn't wind up accepting his offer to visit with her to help her improve those navigational skills. And as we know, she took that flight and was never heard from again. And there's lots of theories as to what happened. But the reality is, if she would have increased her navigational abilities, she potentially could have succeeded with that flight. So I use that to open the book in really a way to let executives know that despite the fact that 70% today, research shows, feel overwhelmed by their circumstances, by all of the information, all of the data, there are ways to increase your ability to navigate the landscape around you. And I really refer to that as your strategic fitness, the ability to assess what's happening, understand where you're trying to go, and then really come up with innovative ways to get there.
And I love how that journey really is that perfect metaphor for leadership, right? Successful leaders must understand where they are, have a clear vision of where they're going, and map out how to get there. And just like navigation, strategic leadership requires situational awareness, which we're going to get into later, forward thinking, and the ability to course correct when needed. So without these elements, leaders and organizations can often lose their way.
One of the things I think that leaders sometimes struggle with, and as I coach leaders in the C-suite, sometimes they tell me, Rich, I have to be the one driving this. I have to be the one that's setting the course. And yes, that's true to an extent. But what I find, Charles, is the best leaders are the ones that are able to harness their people's thinking on a regular basis. So we don't have to have all the answers as a leader, but what we do have to do is ask good questions and hold our people accountable for insights. And I describe an insight as a learning that leads to new value. So if you as a leader can collect those insights, those learnings that lead to new value on a regular basis from your people, and then get them to contribute their thinking on the key challenges and problems, that's going to help set you apart and really help you succeed in the long run.
Great advice. And speaking of strategic leadership, your definition of strategic really stood out to me. How do you define it, and why did you move away from that standard dictionary definition?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I think, to your point, the dictionary definition is for strategic is of or relating to strategy. So, as practical leaders ourselves, that's not as super useful. So, over the last 20 years in my studies of strategic thinking, I really tried to find out what does it mean to be strategic. So, I define strategic as possessing insight that leads to advantage. And when we think about that definition, possessing insight that leads to advantage, we can say, well, a plan can be strategic because a plan can possess the insights of the person who wrote it and help us create advantage. A person can be strategic. They can possess insights that lead to new value to help them and their company gain advantage. But that also then gives us a filter because, Charles, I'm sure you've seen it with the leaders that you've worked with as well. We tend to throw strategic in front of a lot of different words and it loses its relevance. So we hear things like strategic goals, strategic objectives, strategic imperatives, strategic big rocks. And those might be fine, but the reality is we're watering down the value of what is and is not strategic. So again, I really like to think of it as possessing insight, those learnings that lead to new value that help us achieve advantage.
And I love how you state too that putting strategic in front of those words is about as helpful as an umbrella in a hurricane. It's not going to help you at all. And you mentioned 60,000 managers and executives in a study found that a strategic approach to leadership was on average 10 times more important to the perception of effectiveness than any other behavior in the study, twice as important as communication. But so many people don't operate strategically. And you describe these individuals as being trapped in these tactical tombs. So, what's a sign of an unstrategic thinker?
Yeah, and I compare it to a zombie, and not in a negative way, but when we think about zombies, and zombies are very popular in today's culture, one of the things could be said about zombies is they wander aimlessly. And if you're in a business today where you're not outperforming the competition, you're not meeting your numbers, your sales have fallen flat and plateaued, potentially you're wandering aimlessly. And again, the great leaders are the ones that are able to really set the vision. So where do we want to be in 5, 10 years? And then really bring their people along with them. The research, Charles, that you mentioned, another part of that was also this idea that if a leader is perceived as strategic by their people, then their people are 40% more committed to executing their strategies. Because what happens is in many organizations, if a leader's too reactive, so if they're the bumper car at the carnival bouncing from one thing to the next, then they start to operate in this flavor of the month approach to strategy. And many people out there get tired of that over the years. And so they say, look, if it's going to be a flavor of the month, I'm not going to follow that direction because it's going to change next month or next quarter. And so being strategic, being able to set that vision means we're not going to wander aimlessly, but we're going to give ourselves and our people clear, concise direction. So I do think that's one of it. And then the other one I would mention, because we're all so engrossed in meetings on a regular basis, is just the idea that if we're going to be strategic, we've got to be able to stay out of the tactical weeds of the business. And anybody who sat through a meeting that's been more than an hour or two has probably been in those meetings where somebody is unstrategic, meaning they're going right to the tactical stuff and they're not able to elevate out of those tactical weeds. And what happens is that brings everybody down into those rabbit holes. And then people walk out of those meetings going, we didn't really accomplish anything that's going to help us move the needle on our business.
Absolutely. I also found too that a lot of the unstrategic people or leaders, they try to do everything, right? They have no discipline. They can't say no. They try to be all things to everyone, both internally and externally, and they then lack the focus and the impact that they're looking for.
Yeah, Charles, that's a great point that you bring up. Mary Barra, she's been a very successful CEO for General Motors. She took over when they were coming out of bankruptcy. And she was quoted as saying when she took over, look, we're here to win. We aren't going to win by being all things to all people everywhere. She said that's not the right strategy. And we see that time and time again where companies decide to start spreading their resources, trying to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And to your point, Charles, they lose their focus and they lose their position and they lose that ability to say, yes, we deserve to win in this arena. And so they start to lose that competitive advantage. And what might have been competitive advantage at one point turns into competitive convergence, meaning their strategy starts to look an awful lot like the competitors that they're working against. And now as customers, there's no difference. And so if there's no perceived difference, then it just boils down to price. And that's not a game that a lot of companies are set up to win.
I would agree with you on that for sure. Let's explore the solution to being unstrategic. You outlined four areas of strategic fitness: strategy, leadership, organization, and communication. We're going to really focus on the strategy and leadership during our conversation today, but perhaps at a high level, how do these areas contribute to leadership success?
Well, as I've done strategic coaching with C-suite executives over the last 15 years or so, one of the things I realized is that executives, especially today, there's so much information for them to process that when they sit down at the desk, they've got to have almost a checklist, like a pilot has a pre-flight checklist to go through to say, look, we've got all of the key areas covered. And so as I was working with executives, when they were talking with me about the challenges that they face, the challenges their people face, the challenge their business faced, what I started to do, Charles, what I started to see patterns, and those patterns showed those four areas that you identified: strategy, leadership, organization, communication, is being the main areas that they needed to have these checklists in order to overcome some of the key challenges. So those really then became that compass to help leaders navigate, and to your point, call that strategic fitness. So we have areas in each of those, and it's really important for executives to not only think about what are we doing today, and I talk about that as perform, but then also what do we need to do in the future, and I refer to that as transform. So a good executive needs to both perform in today and transform the business for the future. And so by focusing in those four areas, it gives leaders the ability to perform and transform for their business.
Great model and insight, and it's really unpacked in your book very well. Love to unpack now what strategy is not, because sometimes to define a term, it's better to define it as what it is not. So you have some great insights. You say it's the ABCs to understand what strategy is not. And it's not aspiration, A, it's not best practices, B, and it's not being cautious, C.
Exactly. Michael Porter, many people know out there, the professor from Harvard Business School. He's written two of the seminal books on strategy, Competitive Strategy and Competitive Advantage, and has been really a great thought leader in that area. His research showed that 9 out of 10 organizations do not technically have a real strategy. 9 out of 10. So that's amazing when we think about it. And in one of the things that I've found is that the main reason so many organizations lack strategy is because they confuse it with other things. And Charles, we've seen the words goals and objectives and strategy and tactic for many years, but it's still amazing how many leaders in organizations don't have a common language for those terms. So that's the first the first A that you mentioned, aspiration, is really that confusion that I see strategy oftentimes as to be number one in the market, to be the market leader in X, or to be the best in the world at Y. And the reality is those are aspirations. Those are what we're trying to achieve. So strategy is really how are we going to get there? One of the things we think about is, are we thinking or are we reacting? And in most cases, people are not thinking, they're reacting, especially to the competition. So just because the competitor comes out with this product feature or this discount, we've got to match that. But all of a sudden, by matching that, by matching some best practices, now we all of a sudden look exactly like the competitor. So again, we want to avoid that. And then the last one, C, being cautious, especially as a leader rises in responsibility in their organization, it's easy for them to start to play defense and not offense. But what happens then is we start to be protective and we don't look for new opportunities. Blockbuster Video and Netflix are often used as a warning sign, because Blockbuster had the opportunities to purchase Netflix, to do online streaming, and they started to get cautious. They started to create this stronghold and felt like we were just going to protect our business. But in the long run, you've got to be able to evolve and to grow. And so that's really where those three A, B, C's came from, is just looking at historical challenges and saying, what do we need to be aware of?
Great. And before we get into each one, I'd love for you to just unpack the distinction between strategic planning and strategic thinking, because I think a lot of leaders don't know really the difference and they muddy the waters between the two.
Yeah, and it's a great point that you bring up, Charles. And I would make the case that most people listening today are not doing strategic thinking. And why do I say that? Because research out of Harvard Business School shows that only 23% of leaders are strong at strategic thinking. So the reality is, most people out there aren't doing any strategic thinking. And let's consider that for a moment. Think about the plan that you have and look at your plan from this year or for this coming year and ask yourself, how often are you and your team using that plan to drive your daily, weekly, and monthly activities? I work with folks in lots of different industries and lots of different functional areas. And what happens is about 80% of the time, people are not using their plan, and the reason they're not using it is because it's not relevant. And why is that? Because there's no new strategic thinking infusing the plan. So again, we think about the difference, and I'm glad you brought that up. It's an important point for folks. Strategic thinking is the generation of insights that lead to advantage for an organization. Strategic planning is now when you channel those insights or learnings into an action plan that configures your resources to achieve competitive advantage. So if we think about it in simple terms, think about a funnel. Strategic thinking is the top of that funnel. It's that wide opening where we've got new ideas, new learnings, and now strategic planning gets to the neck of that funnel. Here we start to say what's important and what's noise, and let's take what's important, those insights, and now let's channel that into a 1 or 2 page action plan that's really going to drive our business.
Great distinction there. And I'm glad that you made that for us, because I think that's so important before we move on in the conversation. Now let's move into strategic planning. And you have a great framework called the GOST framework, GOST, for strategic planning. Perhaps you can walk our listeners through it.
Sure. I use the GHOST framework, Charles, because those four terms, goals, objectives, strategies, tactics, are the oldest planning terms in history. They date back about 2,500 years to Sun Tzu, the Chinese general and philosopher. Many people might be familiar. He had the writings, which became the book, The Art of War, and that's become a popular book in the last 10, 15 years. And so I like those terms because they're very clear and they've got a lot of history behind them. And so the way that I help folks work through the GHOST framework is I think about, first of all, what are we actually trying to achieve? And what our end goal typically is a plan. And a good plan, whether it's for your business, if you volunteer at a food bank on the weekends and you're trying to develop that nonprofit, you have a plan there. If you're a football coach or a baseball manager, a soccer coach, you've got a plan of some sort. And any plan is going to answer two questions. What are you trying to achieve and how are you going to do it? So, what are you trying to achieve and how are you going to do it? And so the GHOST framework helps leaders answer those questions. Goals and objectives answer that first question. What are we trying to achieve? So the goal is generally what we're trying to achieve. And then the objective is more specific, usually quantified with a time frame. And then strategy and tactics answer that second question. How are we going to achieve it? Strategy is how generally we're going to do it, and then tactics are the more specific, tangible things that are going to help us get there. So, GHOST framework can be a helpful way to answer those two key questions for your plan. What are you trying to achieve? How are you going to do it? And Charles, I would challenge all of the listeners out there, look at your plan this afternoon and ask yourself, does my plan clearly and concisely answer those two questions? What are you trying to achieve and how are you going to do it? If it does, great. If not, you've got a little bit of work to do.
Well, that's very actionable and easy to remember. Another common challenge is distinguishing between strategy and tactics. And these came about during World War II, but help our leaders understand this distinction that are listening to us today.
So, strategy and tactics, to your point, have been confused for a long, long time. And again, back in World War II, strategic took the kind of incidental reference to long term because it was being used in air battles. So it took the long term, and then tactics became short term. But that really wasn't the essence of it. So if we think about the GHOST framework, strategy and tactics are both how we're going to achieve something. Strategy is how generally. So strategy is abstract. It's like leadership, it's like love. You can't reach out and touch strategy. So tactics, though, on the other hand, are going to be more tangible. And I use what I call the rule of thumb, which means if you can reach out and somehow touch it, it's more likely to be a tactic. Even as far back as Sun Tzu, the Chinese general and philosopher I referenced earlier, even far back as him, he mentioned in his book, The Art of War, all the men can see the tactics I use to conquer, but what none can see is the strategy out of which great victory is evolved. So again, strategy is going to be general, it's abstract. Think about it. You can also think about it this way. Strategy is the guardrails on the highway that you're traveling down to reach your destination or to reach your goal. Tactics would be the vehicles on that highway to get you there. So you might say, look, we just want a semi truck, or we want 3 sprinter vans, or we're going to have 5 motorcycles because we want to be nimble and quick to get to our destination. So think about strategy as that road, the guardrails, and then think about the tactics as the specific vehicles that are going to help get you there.
Love that metaphor. Many times I also note that companies don't change their strategy enough. And you identify there's certain moments really to consider changing your strategies because over time, customers' needs evolve, right? There's innovation in the market and competitors change the perceived value, like what you mentioned, what Chipotle did in the food service industry.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of the things I think folks struggle with is because strategy is abstract, they say, well, it's our general approach. So how do we know when to change the general approach? One of the things I would recommend is look at your objectives. And we think about objectives, we often hear the acronym SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So the measurable is a really key piece there. So let's say if you're an HR leader, your goal might be to retain top talent. That's generally what you're trying to achieve. So as an HR leader now, my objective might be to retain 90% of A performers through the end of 2025. So we've quantified it and put a time frame on it. So one of the things that we can do then is if we're a HR leader, is we could create milestones in that objective. So by the end of Q1, we want to have 80%. By the end of Q2, 84%. By the end of Q3, 87%. And then by the end of 2025, Q4, we want to have 90%. So if we use those milestones in our objective, that then, Charles, gives us a great way to ask ourselves, do we need to modify the strategy? So if we're halfway through the year and instead of being at 84%, we're at 62%, that's a good sign that, look, the tactics or the strategy is not working. So we need to change direction there. We need to modify what we're going to do. So I would say that's probably the biggest thing I see is people not having objectives that help them determine when we should change strategy or when we should stay the course.
I love your 5-step strategy process because you kind of put everything together, the strategic thinking piece, the strategic planning piece, to kind of give them a framework on how to do it. If you could, at a high level, if you could just kind of walk us through those steps, and I'm happy to, and it starts with discovery, right? Choosing the right tools. And I love the metaphor you give. It's like the sculptor Michelangelo and how he was doing it differently than other sculptors of his age.
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting when you look at Michelangelo, he always said that you didn't have to create the sculpture. The sculpture was embedded in the stone already. You just had to pull away some of the pieces in order to clearly see it. And I think that's true for a lot of businesses. I think what happens, especially for the more mature businesses, is we add tactics, we add projects, we add products, we add services and initiatives year after year after year. And so we've got this huge, let's call it a stone, and there's so much to it at this point that we've lost sight of what's really valuable to customers. So I do think that those 5 steps that we talk about as I facilitate strategic planning really give people a clear way to develop strategy. So as you mentioned, the first step is discovery. That's really identifying who are the key 6 to 10 people that are going to be involved in this process. What is the process that we're going to use? What are the frameworks? What are the tools? And I'm also a big believer on doing pre-work, comprehensive pre-work. So I typically give folks a diagnostic survey, which asks them about the past, what worked, what didn't work. Ask them about the future. What do you see happening? What are some of the scenarios that are possible? And then I like to have them do a strategy survey. And in the strategy survey, I ask them questions about the market, about their customers, about competition, who's your competitors, what are their strategy, who's your most dangerous competitor and why. And then also the company itself. What are your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, your threats? What's your key internal challenge, your key external challenge? And so by doing a lot of that pre-work and then circulating that pre-work before the meeting, now you've got people 5, 10 steps ahead of where you would normally be. And then to your second point, that second step really is strategic thinking. So now we get together for a day and a half, 2 days. We go through some important tools and techniques to generate new ideas, new thinking, new learnings that are going to really drive our strategy. Then, as we talked about earlier, that those insights from strategic thinking are going to go into that third phase, which is strategic planning. So now we're going to start to think about what should our resource allocation look like across the business and across the competition and across the geography. And then that fourth step is really the strategy rollout. So now that we've got our plan, how are we going to communicate that to people that's going to resonate and that's going to keep it alive throughout the year? And then finally, that fifth step is the strategy tune-up. Just like we wouldn't go 2 or 3 years without tuning up our automobile, we want to make sure on a quarterly basis we're getting together for at least a half day and going through some of the key elements of our strategic plan and asking what's changed and do we need to modify based on what's happening in the environment. So I think those 5 steps, discovery, strategic thinking, strategic planning, the strategy rollout, and strategic tune-up, are a simple way for people to drive their business, yet keep it concise.
And that strategy tune-up phase serves to keep the strategy in that evergreen state and not let it grow stale over time, which is so critical. Because one of the big insights from your research that I found was just in a business context, you state, if you can strategically allocate and just as important, reallocate your resources to the right activities at the right levels, you're going to give yourself the greatest chance to succeed because you mentioned a study of 200 large organizations identified the number one driver of revenue growth to be the reallocation of resources to the faster growing parts of the business. But over 90% of the businesses do not do that. They keep it with the same activities in the same way year after year, which just boggles your mind.
Yeah, Charles, I'm so glad you brought that up because it's such an important point. If you as a leader out there listening to this conversation, if you just once a month sit down for 20 minutes at lunch and ask yourself, what's working, what's not working, what should we do more of, what should we do less of, and start to move even your time. So think about your resources, your time, your talent, the people, the budget. If you do that once a month and you move some things around, you're going to be outperforming 90% of the people out there that are only doing it once a year. You know, the biggest challenge, Charles, that I hear from people is we don't have enough time. But if you sit down once a month and say, what could we stop doing that's no longer adding value? If we pick one item that consumes 1 hour a week, now we've just saved 50 hours. We've added 50 extra hours to our year. So again, I think it's such a great point that you bring up. We've got to have the discipline to step back and really reflect on what are we doing, why are we doing it, and how could we do it differently or better throughout the year and move your resources. Again, people don't like to change because that's inherent in human nature, but the best leaders and the best organizations are reallocating resources, as you mentioned.
You have to prune to grow, right? Creating a cadence of discipline to prune resources throughout the year, like you mentioned, can have a dramatically positive impact on your business.
Yeah, I was just gonna build because you brought up a great word there, Charles, prune. And again, when we think about pruning, just the idea of cutting things off, right? You know, we prune our trees so that the branches grow in new and different ways. Got to do the same thing with the business. Think about what could you prune from the business in order to be more successful.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.